I think this is the perfect lesson for today. Of course, I would say that, but I really do think this is where my heart needs to be. Because as we mentioned to start, waiting is the hardest work of hope. And in this particular series, what I started with was waiting in hope. And then last week we talked about waiting in fire, that life isn't a breeze. It isn't easy, that there is heat that God actually puts us into and holds us over so that we can be purified and made more precious in His sight. And then today, I want to kind of pause in the idea of us waiting for things to happen and start with this idea of waiting in awe, reverence, amazement. So while we wait, what is our reaction? It's kind of going to be the thought here today. And it all started with this thought, waiting is the hardest work of hope, which came from this poem by Lewis Smedes, which I've just been thinking about this week after week. It's one of those where you read it. Most poems I'll throw away after one read. This one's hanging on, so I just want to read this to you one more time. He says, waiting is our destiny as creatures who cannot by themselves bring about what they hope for. We wait in the darkness for a flame we cannot light. We wait in fear for a happy ending we cannot write. We wait for a not yet that feels like a not ever. Waiting is the hardest work of hope. Now, while waiting clearly is difficult, I want to point something out, especially when it comes to waiting on the Lord and what it is we can expect from God. I don't think that you're going to really wait for anything if you don't put enough value in the object that you're waiting for. And I'm going to play that out on an earthly level first, but the point is, if you don't really care about something, then you're going to get really impatient when it comes to doing any kind of waiting. You see, the best things in life are worth waiting for. And most of you have probably heard Eric Clapton's Wonderful Tonight. I just recently heard the story behind that song. He was actually waiting on whoever it was he was with at that time to get ready for wherever it was they needed to go. He found himself getting more and more irritated as hours passed, angry even until he just sat down and wrote this song, trying to make himself believe she was worth the wait. Now, I don't find that particularly romantic, but the one that stands out to me is this Brad Paisley song, Waiting on a Woman. This means a lot to me because personally, for the last 24 years, this is where I've been. Now, it's okay. Yeah, everybody got that awkward, like, oh no, she knows it. She's very aware of this. I don't also, as I talk about this, just waiting can cause impatience unless it's worth the wait. This is not just a woman thing, and I got to point that out in all fairness. My sister happened to marry a man. They had 3 daughters, and almost every time the family needed to go anywhere, it was all of the girls waiting on dad. And so my sister and I have just decided it's not just waiting on a woman. It's waiting on a feminine, is I think what we came up with. And here's the point. Mandy and I would both tell you that the who of our waiting was definitely worth the wait. No doubt about it. Like we'd do it again and again. And that's what I'm trying to let us see today as we start to maybe look more intently at God, is that we live in a world that's so against this idea of having a God that's worth waiting on, worth waiting for, worth the development of our character in. And a lot of that's because we live in what has been called this microwave society. So yeah, I get it. Waiting is hard. And you have prayed to God. You've asked God to bring you an opportunity, to heal you, to bring financial wellness your way, to bring true love to your life. And maybe you've even caught yourself throughout this attempt to get God's attention, wondering, when am I going to get my answer? And what most often keeps us from really believing that God is worth waiting for is any kind of a delayed response or a non-response, because frankly, we begin to believe we deserve it. And so just think about that in life. How many people do you know that actually wait? Wait to purchase that high-priced item by saving up for it. You see, we just buy and buy and buy, and we'll think about the consequences of that down the road. Delayed gratification, it's just not a common trait. It's got to be learned. We have to discipline ourselves that way. And I don't think instant technology has helped mankind in this pursuit for immediate gratification and fulfillment. In fact, if anything, it's helped build up a sense of entitlement. You see, sometimes that entitlement in us just kicks into full gear. And we have to remind ourselves to really think about the bigger picture. Not just what I want, what I think I need in this moment, but what is the bigger picture? And that stems around the question, why? Why do I need to wait on God? Well, waiting is absolutely one of the hardest things we have to do. And all the time, we're looking for the shortest route in traffic because I don't want to wait. We try to find the shortest line in the store because I don't want to wait. And you felt this. It can't be just me. You get into a line that's clearly shorter, and then this other line's going by, and I got to jump over there. We don't want to wait. Waiting on marriage, waiting in marriage, and so on, and so on. And what makes it so hard is that time feels like it's ours, but in reality, there is a God who is the creator and the keeper of time. You know, even in the sports world, there's an official game clock. There's an official timekeeper. And the truth is, in our lives, we tend to get weary on waiting for the Lord because we're confused about who's managing the clock of life. Is it us or is it God? And so often we think, Lord, I've waited long enough. And God says, well, no, on the official clock, there's still time. You see, when we feel like giving up, how many times was it right then when God had that answer? God already knows this about us. He's all-knowing. He knows our thoughts, our feelings, our desires, our needs. And He knows when the right time is to deal with them. And He knows we don't like to wait. Which makes it just perfect. That God places these opportunities for patience in almost every situation we yearn for and long for. He's teaching us something. And so I like to follow this confession in Psalm 139. And I want to read it to you because if we really make this our confession, this can change a lot about our lives and how we think because there's a truth behind this. If you listen to what's being said, it's this: I can wait when I know it's God who's worth waiting for. So the psalmist says, God, investigate my life. Get all the facts firsthand. I'm an open book to you. Even from a distance, you know what I'm thinking. You know when I leave and when I'm back. I'm never out of your sight. You know everything I'm going to say before they start the first sentence. I look behind me and you're there, then up ahead and you're there too. Your reassuring presence coming and going. This is too much, too wonderful. I can't take it all in. I just want you to know, this psalm is reassuring to reminding us who's the keeper of time. And it's a constant reminder that throughout life's journey and all the unknowns that we encounter and all the personal struggles we go through in our timeline, God already knows, He's already prepared to help, and He's already working on a solution. You see, in other words, when we operate like our prayers are on some kind of a time demand, like, God, you need to rush and accommodate what we're asking for, what we're really asking for is disappointment. We need to remember who we're working with, who we're waiting on. It's the all-powerful God. Everybody knows Jeremiah 29:11. I just want you to remember those first few words. God says, I know the plans I've made for you. Think about what's important there. It's in God's hands, in God's care, and He understands and knows what He's doing. And so God specializes in perfect timing. Now, it's going to take a little faith. It's going to take a whole heap of patience. But the truth is, it's always worth waiting on the Lord. Just give you this thought as we get into some meditations here this morning. And the first is this. Waiting is one of God's most sweeping invitations. To wait expectantly on God, to wait with open hands, requires a surrender of our control. It's not in me, God. I'm waiting on you. And it gets to the very roots of our motivations, our fears, and all of our idols. And shows us that God is truly worth the wait. See, this is where we learn that God is not some kind of genie that's there to make wishes to and grant our demands. And that happiness is not dependent on God giving us what we expect Him to give us. You see, while we wait, we make sense out of the naked vulnerability of trust. No matter how disciplined, no matter how organized, no matter how prayerful you might be, you will never outgrow God's invitation to Just wait. And I will say this, the learning curve on that is lifelong. We need these meditations to remind us of this. There is this very human tendency when things go wrong in life to blame God. And so I want to shine some light this morning just right on God. This is what I want our focus to be. And in every song we sang this morning, I appreciated that. It just put our focus back on the one who matters. And so waiting in awe is going to require us to take a big God view as opposed to a small God or little God view. Here's one of the keys to patiently waiting on the Lord. I have to stop thinking about me and focus on Him. That sounds so simple, but aren't we all distracted by the opposite of that every day of our lives? See, when we get stuck thinking about, dwelling on, and comparing all of our problems with those around us, when we magnify what's wrong with us, we tend to minimize what's right about God. And I want to do the opposite this morning, actually, as an exercise. I want together for all of us to start magnifying God, take this big God view. Because I don't believe a small God view gets you anywhere. I don't think it helps with anything. And so start to imagine just how big God is. No, not just in size, right? I mean, you could imagine a giant being, but in power, in love, in mercy, in care. This is a giant being of love. And I believe that having that high view of God is essential to us having any chance to overcome sin in our life and facing trials in our life. You see, only a great and glorious God could be the solution to all the problems of our life. So how we view God becomes very important to who we are. And perhaps I would say one of the greatest problems facing the church today is that we've been kind of wooed into perhaps taking a smaller view of God than is real. I was thinking last week, we were piling up that 2 feet of snow. We were distanced again from one another. We weren't here. And I missed being together. But I was thinking about what it is when we are together. And through classes and through study and through sermons, we talk about God. And we talk about what God is like, and we talk about certain parts of His character, and we try to explain how He works in this world, and we kind of define who God is to the point where it almost becomes we're defining a word. Like, here's the word God, and here's the definition of it. Like, we've kind of figured Him out in all of these ways. We have discussions about God, and we have conversations about where He's active. But you know, all the while, we rarely stop long enough to realize that if God actually appeared here before us today, we wouldn't say anything. We wouldn't have answers. We wouldn't have descriptions. We would just be stopped in awe of the glorious presence of God. Just think about that. If you've got God fully in your mind, if He fully shows up, you would be in awe. We would all fall face down, quiet, silent before the glorious God of heaven. And isn't that consistent with the Bible? You know, the Bible gives us several of these stories where people get to glimpse God. Again, never the full glory of God. That would just destroy a man. But just to glimpse Him. And the reactions are all so similar. The people who saw Him talk about how, look, we didn't get into this conversation about everything we knew and everything we thought. We didn't ask Him all our questions that we thought were so important. All we did when we glimpsed God is we fell silent before Him and bowed down. They fell on their faces before His glory because they were overcome with awe. You know, a small God view is not going to do that. A little view of God fosters this spirit of thanklessness and self-reliance and self-importance. And if you're listening in Romans 1, this is really what Paul is saying is the problem in mankind. You see, there's a lot of things that God have done in this world that can be seen. They can be understood. I mean, even the things God's created start to show you who the Creator is. And so, in a sense, there's no excuse for the things we do against God when we recognize He made these things around us. But notice verse 21 is the cause. He said they knew God, but they didn't give Him glory and they didn't give Him thanks. So their thinking became useless. Their foolish minds were filled with darkness. They said they were wise, but they became fools. You see, we become ungrateful people when we take this small view of God because we stop realizing how good we have it. Just think. If we understood how big and loving God is, what would your response to that be? I tell you, an appropriate response would be, no way. He did that for me. I know who I am. He's holy, and He wants to live with me and work with me and have His Spirit. He gave His Son to die for me. The only response to a God that holy is to be overwhelmed. But when we take a small view of God, develop the belief and the attitude that somehow God was created to serve us. And it happens all the time. I hear this all the time. With a small view of God, people would say, look, if God's so loving, then why are all these children dying of starvation and sickness? And why does God allow these things to happen? You see, when we have a small view of God, when He's not making us happy, we just go serve something else. Find an idol to replace Him. When we have a small view of God, we can't help but diminish what God's doing in others and the people that God loves. You see, when God gets smaller and smaller in our lives and in our minds, then our self gets bigger and bigger by nature, and we start saying ridiculous things because we have no idea who we're talking about. When we foster a small view of God, we actually get to a place where we judge Him. If God is real, why does evil exist? If God is kind, why do so many people hate? We begin to act like we were placed on this earth to judge Him, rather than the high view, where we realize that one day we'll be called before Him, and that He's the judge, and He will question us. And we'll have to give an answer for things like, if you're so loving, how come your neighbor never saw it? And if you're so kind, how come those in your lives didn't see Jesus in you? If you're so understanding, how come you failed to show others who I am? You see, a small view equals arrogance. And I think that's one of the biggest problems facing the church today. And so I want to take this second meditation this route. We must never forget that God is still on the throne. Look at Isaiah chapter 6, and you're familiar with this text. I just read the first few verses. It says, in the year of King Uzziah, when he died, I saw the Lord sitting at a very high throne. His long robe filled the temple. Heavenly creatures of fire stood above him. Each creature had 6 wings. It used 2 to cover its face, 2 wings to cover its feet, and 2 for flying. Each creature was calling out to the others, holy, holy, holy is the Lord, all-powerful. His glory fills the whole earth. Now there's a lot there. But what I want you to notice is the very beginning. In the year that King Uzziah died, I got this vision of the throne of God. This is significant. You see, just for a little background, King Uzziah is one of those rare good kings. Actually, in the 52 years that he reigned, it was a pretty good time to be alive in the land. It was prosperous. They weren't at war in a way that was detrimental to them. The borders were safe. They were living a pretty good life, and then he died. And you don't have to follow the history of Israel too closely to know that their happiness, their success, was almost wholly reliant on who was sitting on that physical throne at the time. And so this good king has died. What's going to happen next? Who's going to reign next? And I want you to notice it's at that time in Isaiah's life that God takes Isaiah and He shows him who is on the throne that matters. You see, God is shaking loose the idea in Isaiah's mind that things terrestrially depend on who's on a temporary throne, but that what always matters is that there is a celestial king who sits on a throne now and forever. And I think sometimes we need that same shaking. There is a throne that counts, And there's a God who's not forfeited that throne. He still sits there. You see, Isaiah needed to see what was unseen. He needed to believe what seemed unbelievable. And so God shows him heaven, the seat of ultimate power. And as a response, Isaiah 6:5, I love, he says, "Oh no, I'll be destroyed. I'm not pure. I live among people who are not pure, but I've seen the King, the Lord all-powerful." Isaiah doesn't start talking politics with God around his throne. He's fearful for his life. He's fully aware of how impure he is as a human being and the guilt of his own sin. And I just want you to think about that. Isaiah is a prophet. He's a pretty good guy. And the list he comes up with is, well, I've said some bad things. Okay. What's your list for God? I want to be in your presence, but here's what I've done. Here's my life. This is what this looks like. But Isaiah is undone by his unholiness in the presence of God. And here's the point. When the good king died, and I get it, Isaiah might have been worried about his own life. Like, whoever's king next is going to be really important to what I do or try to do. He might have been worried about his future, concerned for the nation, even overwhelmed about these thoughts of what comes next. God did not show up and say, "Hey, Isaiah, tell me all your problems." God brought Isaiah close and said, "Look at me. Listen, I don't want to make light of all the issues that are represented, even just in this church today. It breaks my heart what some of you are going through right now in wrestling. It's overwhelming, it's heavy, it's big. And I so often come up with the thought that, God, I haven't got near the wisdom to help deal with this. I don't even know if I can help. These things are pressing, and I understand that. And I don't want to minimize that, but sometimes the solution is not looking more at your problem, but the solution is looking beyond it to the throne and the one who's reigning now and forever. So remember, this is unbelievable. Just imagine if there was some way right now that we could just open up the ceiling into heaven and you could see into this throne room and look at the glory of God, even where angels cover their face with wings because the glory is so great. If you could see that even for 10 seconds right now, you think you'd be thinking about your problems the next 10 seconds? Man, if you could see that, you'd forget about your problems the rest of the day, month, maybe even the rest of your life. You see, when we see the solution, those problems and how important they are start to melt. And so here's another meditation. I'll take it in this direction. Well, what's it like to glimpse God? I've thought about this, and I imagine that even that peek into heaven would take your breath away. To take your speech away, which that's a big thing for me. Like I would try to look, but it would be too great. And I would recognize how much I don't belong there. And I would fall on my face in worship because there's a God of heaven who wants to shine even on me. Now, I imagine that because that's pretty much how the Bible shows it. You see, people who encountered God all had these kind of similar responses. They fainted. They fell on their faces. They believed they were going to die, just be consumed by the glorious holiness of God. They saw their own unworthiness, and they were overwhelmed by His presence. And there's something good about not just talking about God, but just take a moment to think about if you could see Him. What would your response to seeing Him be? And Ezekiel becomes a good point of reference for this because, like Isaiah early on in his ministry, God gives him this view. And so Ezekiel 1 starts this way, verse 26. He says, "Now above the dome there was something that looked like a throne. And it looked like a sapphire gem. And on the throne was the shape like a human. Then I noticed that from the waist up, the shape looked like glowing metal with fire inside. And from the waist down, it looked like fire. And a bright light was all around, and the surrounding glow looked like the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. And it seemed to look like the glory of the Lord. So when I saw it, I bowed face down on the ground, and I heard his voice speaking. Now maybe you've read this description before, but I want you to just start to think about what Ezekiel's describing. Other mortals have tried to put human words on what seeing God is like. And there's a lot of similarities here. There's this being, it kind of looks like the shape of a human. It's not human. There's a throne, and it's glowing, seems to be the case here. You know, some witnesses of this have used the idea of a bright glowing gemstone or this rainbow that breaks through on a cloudy day and all of a sudden glows. In almost all descriptions of this, though, you get that picture of fire. And I pick up on the idea that whatever it is Ezekiel is truly seeing here, he's really having a difficult time putting our words onto that picture. And so he says, well, you know, from the waist up, I just think that's interesting, right? Like, I can only take in a part at a time. So I'm kind of looking at the waist up. And what I see from the waist up sort of looks like this. It's like glowing metal. You know, when it gets so hot, and in the middle, there's like this fire in the middle of it. And so this is what I see, and maybe like a rainbow that's coming out to glow along with it. And so that's like the waist up. And if I look from the waist down, well, it kind of looks like, well, really more the same. It looks like fire. You can see. So how do you picture this? Our words fall short. We're describing a holy being. Holy means set apart, but really more than that, it means there's nothing like it. How do you put a description on something there's nothing like? And Ezekiel's wrestling with this, and he says, well, if I had to put a word on it, it's like a glowing fire. He's the brightest thing I've ever seen. When you look at him, it's like just the sight's going to consume you, and you'll die. That's the upper half. Then the lower half, well, it's like that too. So how would you describe this? What is it to see God on the throne? Kind of the shape of a human, but he's not human. Like a shining gem. It's that rainy day when all of a sudden that sun bursts through and a rainbow just glows through the whole sky. It's like hot metal glowing with fire right in the middle. That's what his glory is like. But with all of that thought about, I want you to understand this. Whatever description you come up with, whatever words you have to picture it, it's the result that matters. It's when you see it, you fall on your face. We see our own unworthiness. That's it. He says, I fell face down before him. In fact, remember Isaiah said, when I saw the throne, I thought, woe is me, I'm a dead man. And so I want to think about right now with the rest of our time, what it would be for us to practice waiting on the presence of God. And so I want you to think about this in terms of an exercise. What is the best thing to say when you come into the presence of a holy, holy, holy God? Nothing. Silence. What are you going to add to that? Like to be loud into his presence, to be overwhelmed by his presence. And so here's what I want you to think about. What if our day started with trying to take in the wonder of God, the glory of God? Not just rush into the throne room with my to-do list for God to get done for me today, but to come in wonder and in awe of who he is. There's this being that if we could see him, we wouldn't have any words. We wouldn't have anything to add. We would just collapse in reverence. The question is really with this exercise, can we put aside our selfish pride? Take the time to just imagine that scene. Just be silent. Just be still. Simply remember that he is the God of the universe, and I'm just this creature living here on earth. I want to give you a passage that will help with this meditation and maybe practice if you try this in your mornings. But Ecclesiastes 5:1-2 is again, some real wisdom for this idea. Solomon says, be careful when you go to worship at the temple. Now, he doesn't then say, be careful because, it's important what others think. You got to look good, so, they think you take this important. He doesn't talk about all the temporary, physical, terrestrial things that flood our minds. He says, when you go into the temple, don't forget who you're going to see. So it's better to listen than to offer foolish sacrifices without even knowing you're doing wrong. Think before you speak, and be careful about what you say to God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so say only a few words to God. And here's the point about this. I think it would be good for us to remember this principle again and again. And don't get me wrong. God wants to hear from us. We'll talk about prayer next week, actually. Prayer is so important to this conversation. And God wants to listen to our hearts. My point is, so often we're so quick to speak out to God that it's just words. It's not our heart. And so this is a good primer for that conversation. You see, the sacrifice of a fool is to burst in talking and never stop to just bask in the radiance of the glory of God. Oh, look where I am. At the throne of God, and He'll hear. He'll hear. Take your time. Take in His glory. See, even in this place, as I was thinking last week, so often we rush in and we want to praise God. We want to sing out. We want to say the right words, and we want to make commitments to God, and we want to show God how much we love Him and show Him, oh God, if you only knew how much we care. And what this passage is reminding us of is that a wise person will recognize, before we get to any promises and praises and words of our own, stop. There is a glorious, big, and holy being here. And I'm just this small, earthly being. So I'm just going to be quiet for a while. No words, no quick promises. Just going to think about what God looks like, how big He is. And when we get to look at the answer first, problems look a lot different immediately. You know what this is a dynamic perspective shift. I'm asking you today, could you do that as you try to commune personally with God? Just take some time to acknowledge there's this big and holy being in heaven, and to understand our place before Him. I will say this, I love, almost more than anything, in fact, I think I love it more than anything now. I love more than anything singing at the top of my lungs worship songs to God. And I thank all of you for never looking sideways at me. But when we worship at home, some people do look at me. I'm not judging, I'm just saying. I'm loud. And I just love throwing that out there. But the truth is, I occasionally need to stop, reset, shut up, and remember who it is I'm praising, who it is I'm about to proclaim my love to and make promises to and commitments to lay all my burdens aside, to cast all my crowns, allegiances, loyalties down at His feet and truly recognize this is the one to whom I surrender it all. Lay on my face before God. Be still. I just want to suggest that as we get impatient waiting, maybe we've forgotten how worth the wait is when it's God you're waiting on. You see, if we're to see what Ezekiel and Isaiah saw, what would you say? God takes you up to see His throne room. God opens heaven and says, Ezekiel, peek in. What are you going to say? Nothing. You would just take some time to acknowledge you are worthy. You would hear the chorus of the angels. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. I want to tell you today, I believe with all my heart that God is worth the wait. And when I'm centered on that thought, cares, problems, issues, trials, they all tend to get their right place when God's first. They're not as overwhelming as they were a moment ago, because I know the one who holds it all in his hand, and he cares for me. So I'm asking you just to bask in his presence for a while. I'll leave you with Psalm 62. First two verses are, I wait quietly before the Lord. For my victory comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, where I will never be shaken. Verse 5, let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will not be shaken. My victory and honor come from God alone. He is my refuge, a rock where no enemy can reach me. Oh my God, trust in him at all times. Pour out your heart to him, for God is our refuge. And so maybe it's just a subtle shift. But before we go to God and share everything we need him to do, we need to stop and recognize what an honor it is that he thinks of me. Bask in glory. We can wait when we're waiting in awe. There isn't anything God's given us to overcome in this life that he won't help us through. We'll wait patiently on the Lord. If you're here this morning, you need to become a Christian, a child of God, you can be buried with Christ. We'll baptize you right now. And that's something else that gets the angels excited. They rejoice when just one lost soul turns his way from the world back to the home of the Father, and through Jesus Christ is rescued from their sins. If you want to do that this morning, let us know how we can assist you. If you're here and you need our prayers, I want to say this, because I'm going to be talking about prayer the next couple of weeks. This is not don't say anything to God ever. This is remember who you're talking to. But if there's prayers that you're having a hard time uttering and you need help from a brother or sister in Christ, we'll help you talk to God. He is listening. He does hear. We can help. If we can help in any way, you can let us know.